Hello, everybody, and welcome to the third episode of the SILP podcast. I'm here today with Akshat Goyal, who is the head of the Society for International Law and Policy, and our guest, Mr. Vikram Raghavan. I would like to begin this podcast by quickly introducing our guest here today. Vikram is a lead counsel for operations policy at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. He works on a diverse range of topics pertaining to the bank's mandate and its legal and policy framework, along with several other projects related to macroeconomics and fiscal issues, conflict, refugees, sovereign debt, along with many others across different countries in Asia, Africa, and Eastern Europe. He's been involved in producing the bank's flagship 2011 World Development Report on Conflict, Security, and Development. Having received the Bretton Woods 75 Award for preserving the bank's institutional memory, Vikram takes a keen interest in the bank's archives and history. Before working at the World Bank, Vikram was an associate at O. Melviny and Myers, where he worked on banking, bankruptcy, and private equity transactions, as well as international arbitration. He has completed his undergraduate degree at the National Law School of India University, Bangalore, and has obtained a master's in international law from NYU Law School, where he was a Hosler Global Scholar. Vikram is an active member of the American Society of International Law and has served on its executive council. Vikram particularly is passionate about mentoring law students and junior lawyers, and I'd like to believe that's one of the reasons why he's joined us here today. Vikram has a long-standing private interest in constitutional and public law issues and has co-founded Law and Other Things, a widely read peer-reviewed legal blog. Additionally, he has authored The Communications Law in India, which is a much consulted treatise and which has been cited by India's Supreme Court. Vikram, we thank you for being here today and welcome you to the SILP podcast.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Akshat Goyal. I am the convener of the society. And Vikram, thank you so much. We are extremely grateful to have you here today. And to just get things rolling, maybe we can start off with your work as the lead counsel of World Bank. It'd be really great if you could illuminate for us what your day-to-day work includes, what your work at the World Bank looks like, and what all it entails.
So thank you, Rudra and Akshat. I am very honored to be asked by SILL to join this podcast. I'm actually a big fan of podcasts. I think was an early adopter of them even before we had legal podcasts, because I would drive and I would need to listen to something. So podcasts were easily downloadable on something called an iPod, which doesn't exist anymore. But there were no legal podcasts, and I'm glad that we now have podcasts. Of course, we have many podcasts, including great podcasts from India. So this is another medium to engage lawyers, law students, and the general community interested in international law. So that's great. To your question about what I do at the World Bank, I do many different things, I suppose, every day. That's what keeps it interesting, so far at least. My present job involves operational policy. That is the bank's policies, which are like its internal rules that govern how it finances projects and programs in its member countries, and other types of assistance that it may render, which are not strictly lending-based assistance. So my particular focus on the policy side is primarily on countries that experience conflict and violence, those that have undergone military coups or political instability, and we have had quite a few in the last few years: Afghanistan, Myanmar, Sudan. I also deal with refugee and forced displacement issues. In fact, that is a subject that I first got into while I was in law school in my fifth year when I did a seminar course. And then 25 years later, I returned to it, having not sort of worked in it or done much in it for all those years. and then in a way reconnected back with what I did because it was an extension of my work on conflict, and the World Bank began working more on refugee and displacement issues. And so I needed to sort of brush up my knowledge and also um, work on projects that deal with refugees and host communities. Again, I'm sort of a policy person in giving advice to those who actually work on the projects, but I'm also involved in the operational aspects of this work. So this year, for instance, I'm also a part of the team that is producing the World Bank's annual flagship, its most important publication, which is called the World Development Report, which looks every year at a particular theme in international development. And this year's theme, or the 2023 theme, is refugees and migration. So that is sort of an extension of that work. Now, I also handle other things, other policy questions, also legal, of a legal nature. What kind of expenditures can the World Bank finance? Can we finance a police car? What if it's misused? So, what are the terms and conditions? What are the fiduciary arrangements we must put in place? Can we finance vaccines? Can we use security forces in implementing our projects? Can we have interactions with rebels or insurgents? I also work on a lot of other subjects, conditionality in World Bank loans, some is aspects of sovereign debt, expropriation issues, um, questions relating to the Articles of Agreement, which I guess we can come to later, which is the World Bank's charter. And then lots of issues which relate to the World Bank's membership, how it deals with non-members, even though it's now an organization that has in excess of 187 members. There are still some countries that are non-members, and so the World Bank's dealings with those non-members is also something that I've worked on before. So yeah, so lots of exciting stuff, and it's never a dull moment.
And we look forward to getting into each and every part of everything you've done on today's podcast, Vikram. Just taking
Thank
in
you.
something that I personally found really interesting as to what you said was you found yourself getting back to refugee law years after you graduated from law school while working at the World Bank. And apart from what we have seen here at law school, is that the World Bank has so much to offer, not only students such as me and Akshat, but also practicing lawyers. What do you think were your motivations getting into the World Bank or pursuing a career at the World Bank? And how do you find working in refugee law and circling back to refugee law after so many years?
So in terms of my motivations for a career in law or the World Bank, I suppose, which came later, I decided to study law when I was probably 14 or 15. I don't think I had any particular motivations, at least in a grand sense. I guess I was moved whenever I saw an act of injustice, like a poor person who was scolded or mistreated, like most of us, are moved to do something, although we might not actually do so because we don't know what to do. But it's also true that my father and grandfather were both lawyers, so I can't deny that was also an influence, although I was very clear that I did not want to practice the law that they did, which was primarily civil litigation. Nothing wrong with it. Of course, it's very satisfying, but I didn't want to have the usual taint of nepotism and be a third generation lawyer, so I chose something very different. And so, in terms of how I got there, I took the commerce stream in plus two, which, of course, at that time, we're talking about 1990, did not give me a lot of options beyond the standard economics, which no one had fully explained to me could actually be a career now that I work with lots of economists. I could have also gone the CA, chartered accountant route, but then I also heard about this new school in Bangalore. Remember, at that point, it hadn't graduated a single student. This is the first NLU. Of course, there were other law schools, but law as a whole was generally not particularly favored as a career option. And so, I think everyone I spoke to thought I was crazy or mad or misguided at best if I actually considered law school as a career. which of course is very different now. But I was intrigued enough to visit the campus. The NLSIU campus at that point was not where it is presently. It was in a temporary campus in the heart of Bangalore. And so I visited it in my 12th standard. And I sort of, that interest sustained enough for me to take the entrance test, which wasn't a CLAT, but it was a sort of a self-standing, very small scale entrance test, which I passed and got in. And the rest, of course, in that respect, is history. Now, you also asked about what motivated me to join the bank. Well, I must confess, again, here I had no grand motivations during law school. In fact, my first job was at a law firm. And it was only there that I learned about the World Bank as a possible career. I had studied law and development. I think we took 3 courses on law and development: law and poverty, law and urban development, and law and rural development. Um, and those courses were widely mocked at that point, but only I now see the value of those courses, not because they taught me anything that I directly apply. I mean, they do. The word poverty alleviation, for instance, or rural development programs, I first learned in law school, which most people may or may not get an opportunity to encounter unless they're economists or they're administrators who work on these programs. But I also knew, of course, the World Bank financed the buses in the city that I lived in. But beyond that, I knew next to nothing about the World Bank. And it, I guess, was in my third year at my law firm that I was asked by a lawyer who worked at the law firm, who had moved to the World Bank, to come and join him. And I decided to wait for a proper vacancy to arise, because I certainly didn't want to be associated with a lawyer from my old law firm in the World Bank. And so I am grateful that he gave me that opportunity, but I waited for a while to get to a job that was open. And then I interviewed for it, and then I started there 21 years ago. And I've been there, but doing different things.
That's extremely interesting, Vikram, especially being one of the few students in the pioneering batches of national law schools as we know now must have been quite interesting. And being from one of them, I certainly know that a motivation, or rather a dream, for a lot of us law students entering into NLUs these days is working either in an international law firm or working in an international organization such as the World Bank. So you having being having done both of them, how would you think, or according to you, how does working in the legal division of an international organization compare to working at a full-fledged law firm, an international law firm that too, such as O. Melvini?
Well, I think there are many differences. The one that most people might find most striking, well, some people may not, is the pay. No one can match the salaries and bonus of an international firm, or for that matter, now increasingly even an Indian corporate law firm. But of course, that is not everything. Pay is not everything. And some could also say that law firms have much larger offices, which is true. I think they are much more nicer spaces to work in. Of course, there are firms and firms, but the general international law firm has a lot more, let's say, more aesthetic physical appeal, which of course doesn't really matter now that we all also work virtually. But in terms of work, an international organization is a lot more hierarchical than a firm, where there is, somewhat of a flat structure. There's you, and then there's the partner in charge. There may be a mid-level or senior associate in between. Or if you're in litigation, for instance, there would be either you're arguing the case yourself or you're assisting a senior, right? There may be one other person in between you. But at an organization, there is a manager, then there's the manager's manager, then there's the manager's manager's manager, and then over above all of them are, the general counsel, and then the managing director, and then the president. So in that sense, it's like a government. You know how IAS officers in India love to call their seniors sir. We don't go that far, but it is not the flat structure you have in private practice.
Right. Vikram, also circling back to again, you being one of the pioneer batches of NLUs, and especially one that did not, as you pointed out, did not have any other graduates at that time. So starting at a NLU in India, graduating from a newly furnished law school that did not really have much of a history, so to speak, of back then, how did you go on to build such an inspiring career abroad? Like the opportunities not only in the World Bank, but even before that at O'Melveny. How exactly do you come by them? What motivated you to look outside India as a field, even for corporate law? And yeah, what were your motivations and how did you build on them to get to where you are?
So I'm not sure I have had an inspiring career. In fact, I was thinking today that um, the there are many other folks who are a lot more inspiring and interesting than my somewhat boring career. I've had only two jobs, which is unusual for somebody who's not in, let's say, litigation. And again, I'm not sure it's as inspiring as people who actually go and do human rights work or litigation and stand up, for injustice and all of the things that I said motivated me to go to law school. I think that there was some survey on Bar and Bench or Live Legally India a few years ago, which looked at possible few senior advocates, and someone wrote in that I could have been a contender if I hadn't decided to work behind a desk in Washington, which I think is true. I don't know about being a senior advocate, but working behind a desk is true. So I do say, though, I am very proud of my Indian legal education. I would not give it up for anything. I certainly wouldn't. If I had to do it all over again, I would do it the way that I did, um, because it cost me virtually nothing by today's standards, and yet it was a very solid and comprehensive foundation. I just mentioned refugee law. I can guarantee you, if I had studied, uh, did an American JD, there was little chance that I would have taken refugee law, because there would have been core courses to take, and refugee law may not have even popped up in my head. It certainly didn't feature on any course curriculum in the LLM program, or maybe I wasn't attentive enough. But the fact that I did a seminar course in refugee law were at the end of my 5 years at NLSIU was a testament to the fact that that 5 year course, 60 courses, 60 subjects, which is the NLSIU model, as intense as it is, was really, you know, uh, tour de force in terms of understanding different legal subjects. I think it's fashionable now, particularly among some NLU and Indian law grads who work with foreign governments or in American law schools, to pretend as if their life began at Harvard or Oxford, where they went to do their masters. Some of them simply whitewash their Indian legal education as if it were an irritating space occupying typo on their resume. Um, Now, one of my friends called this treason of an intellectual character. I don't think I would go so far, but yes, I do think that I'm very proud of that education, which of course cost nothing even by today's standards, which also makes me feel very fortunate. But it also equipped me, as I said, with a very comprehensive base of knowledge. And it made legal education actually quite serious, just like medical and engineering education, certainly medicine, where you have to know the entire body. Even if you decide to become an ophthalmologist and focus only on the eye, you can't ignore, let's say, what happens in the feet. And I think that in that sense, a comprehensive 5 year course is the best education. Now, of course, there are 3 year courses, and very fine lawyers, in fact, most of the people who our judges today and the senior advocates today didn't do a 5 year course. But I do think that there's something to be said for the fact that, when you're out of high school and you join a 5 year law course, it's a solid training, which I think that is perhaps, as good as anywhere in the world. So I certainly thought my LLM, which I did get, was somewhat of a window dressing over what had been a very solid foundation that I had in a fairly primitive setting, because we didn't have computers, there were no phones. The library closed at 6 p.m. You're allowed to borrow 3 books. We certainly had no access to international journals other than those that managed to reach a year later on the shelf. But with all that, I think that it is a great foundation that I had. And of course, one must pay tribute to the wisdom and the foresight of those great law teachers who designed the system. Upendra Bakshi, N.R. Madhava Menon, who of course founded NUJS as well, Ranbir Singh, MP Singh, who again was associated with your school, because they really transformed legal education in the 80s and the early 90s. And I was lucky to be in that first generation that benefited from that transformation. And 30 years later, you now see NLU and both NLU and non-NLU, and I for one condemn the binary distinctions between such grads. I certainly feel, and I certainly see in my own practice, that non-NLU grads are as good or even better than NLU grads. So I reject that system that has crept in. But you can see that in a way, there has been a radical transformation in how lawyers are trained. And I think the results you're already seeing, and we will continue to see. It is my big hope, in a way, that now that we produce so many lawyers, which the legal system itself cannot absorb, they will infiltrate other fields of, public activity, intelligentsia, the administration, civil society, uh, corporates, and bring to bear their knowledge and training, rigor, in a manner that would actually grow, the society and the country as well. Like it didn't before, when we only focused so much on technical engineering and medicine. Anyway, I'm sort of going off tangent, but I also benefited, again, going back to the question of a career, um, by participating in a number of activities, moot courts, debating, publishing, writing, and great internships. And again, all those were done in a fairly simple way. You didn't have international internships like you have today. Nobody knew the word download. When we did our moot court, the word download was not a word I would have understood if you told me it, because there was nothing to download. And so that base, though, of different activities, which continues to sustain at a much greater level law schools today, is really what propelled me, for which I'm very grateful.
Definitely. And Vikram, I think you address a very important point in that answer, which is the very evident and very fast-paced change that Indian legal education is undergoing in today's day and age. And building upon that, I'd just like to ask you one short question. As someone who has had such a prolific career abroad, how do you think Indian law universities and the Indian legal education compares and competes with that which is being taught in the West and countries such as the US and Europe? And while answering that, I'd just like to ask you a follow up question. In what qualities do you think an aspiring law student can bring to a classroom, to an internship, or to a competition?
Well, I make it a point to visit Indian law schools every year. I haven't done it in the last few years given COVID, but I certainly interacted with law school students online. But I think I've visited most of the NLUs and many of the major non-NLUs. And so I think that most schools have now got their act together. And of course, there are variants, even at the great National Law School, which is supposed to be so celebrated. There have always been deficits and problems of, the quality of teaching, and, you know, whether the curricula is sufficiently responsive to the job market. But I generally think that Indian legal education today is second to none. And I don't mean that because of from any sense of nostalgia. I work in an international organization. I work with students from across the world. And I think that especially now with moot courts and with writing opportunities that are now open, I mean, you have to remember that when we studied law, publishing in an international journal was not an easy option. Not only did you have to physically send a copy to the journal, you often didn't know what was out there. But today, at the touch of their finger, sitting, in wherever they are, a law student in India can access the whole world. And so those opportunities have transformed the nature of legal education, but also have forced Indian law schools to sort of up their act, especially since they now charge these astronomical amounts, which of course is a different subject I won't get into. I think they have now realized there has to be value for money, and also, the early graduates are now giving back. Certainly at National Law School, I think a significant number of the faculty now are former alumni who know the problems the school face and are now bridging it, but they've also come armed with foreign degrees, which again I don't particularly think are necessarily, let's say, they don't necessarily embellish somebody's resume. That's but my personal opinion. Of course, I don't have a PhD myself, but I think that to your question, I think it's it's I go to countries where there are no law schools, or the law schools are as, let's say, primitive as they were in India in the 50s or 60s, where there were good schools, there were pockets of great excellence, Delhi, Madras, Allahabad, so Benares. But the rest of the country didn't really have great legal education. And today that has transformed. And so I think that it is a very optimistic scenario in my view. But to go to your second question about what are the valued qualities that an aspiring lawyer can bring to their workplace, I let me throw out a few ideas in no particular order. I would not over specialize too quickly. I think that's a temptation. In fact, it's sometimes something that needs to be resisted, even by gently pushing back against the system, especially if you join a law firm where there's a tendency to very quickly identify as to what practice you want to belong to and what you want to do. I know that people are breaking through that because they leave and then they go do something else. They go to an LLM. So there are ways to sort of avoid getting sort of swept into the current of highly specialized legal practice. But that is something I would strongly emphasize. I certainly, in my first 3 or 4 years, did not did many different things, which others did not have the chance to do because they joined a particular practice. I worked at a firm which was a big firm, but in a smaller office of the firm, and so it was easier, paradoxically, to work with different partners in very diverse practices across the two major streams of transactional litigation, which is often a bridge that people don't cross even with, in their early years. So I think that would be the one thing, not to over specialize, but to learn as much of the law as is practiced. Um, be curious, volunteer to work on different things. When people call me and they say they are stagnating in a firm, which again is entirely possible, I always say, well, have you thought of working for somebody else in another practice group? Because that's what I did. I kind of didn't particularly like the assignments I got, and I kind of sought out, another practice group. I continued working with the first group I was assigned. Interestingly, I think that work got more interesting as I worked with another group. And I think that going out and saying that you don't know much, but you're willing to work hard and learn is a nice way to, you know, um, to sort of to get them to notice you and um, to make them want to work with you, even if it's at the very bottom. So try it out. You impress by hard work and diligence. You don't have to suck up or say nice things to senior persons all the time at parties. Impressed by what you do, and then of course stay up to speed with the latest case law, regulatory developments, or market practices, depending on what type of practices of law you are primarily working in. You must have very solid research and writing skills. I think that is something I just finished the interviews for my fellowships that NYU every year has with my group. They place their LLMs with us, and they pay for the stipend. It's a very generous program, and 7 of my former fellows who worked with me are now my colleagues at the World Bank. And I think one of the things that they and I look for, because I now involve my former um, uh, fellows who came in as sort of fresh law students to work with me, I involve them in choosing the next batch because I think it's more interesting that way. And we look very much for people with strong legal research and writing skills. Talking anyone can do, but you also impress by writing clearly, diligently. That is a big spot in Indian legal education. Very few clear writers even today, because in litigation, uh, verbosity still pays. Not everyone writes as clearly as some of the judges who are the exception. And writing is, of course, also important on the corporate or transactional side. Writing a very crisp memo. I tell people now, if you cannot write, if it's more than phone screens long, don't bother. The client is not going to read it. So that requires you to write well, but also concisely but precisely, and there's no substitute for it. So those are sort of my scattershot ideas of what might be good qualities, as you asked for, um, that an aspiring lawyer can bring to their workplace.
That's extremely interesting, Vikram, and I really appreciate and like how in almost every single of the qualities, one thing that remains constant is just being yourself, not portraying yourself as someone else. And I think that's something that sometimes get lost, and it's extremely important to reverberate again and again. On a similar note, you talked about how opportunities should be grabbed, and in your experiences as well, you all of us are sort of a summation of the opportunities we took and went ahead with, right? So what do you think students and professionals who are presently trying to build a career at the bank should be doing right now? What do you envisage their road to the bank as?
Well, first, I would recommend that no one intend to build a career at the World Bank as an objective in and of itself. I don't. I think I see many job statements saying that I've always wanted to work for the World Bank, which I often don't believe, because, like I said, in my own case, I didn't know what the World Bank was till I got there, and sometimes that humility helps. But if that is humility, but or ignorance, I don't know. Um, but I think it's best to land in the path, if you're destined to do so, by trial and error, because I, for one, strongly believe that working outside the bank first, whether at a law firm or a think tank, in a court, is absolutely key, because um, that's what shows you the world outside. At the end of the day, the World Bank is a large bureaucracy like any other international organization or a government. And there are things, while it's a very diverse, interesting place, probably one of the most interesting organizations because of the breadth of subjects that it deals with. Really, it spans the whole world, and the coverage is global, truly unprecedented in terms of the scale of opportunity. I still think there are things that a person will miss if they don't have a life before the World Bank, or don't deliberately plan for one, but rather want to. I see graduates today when I say, "What do you want to do?" and they say, "Well, I want to join an international organization," which is a good thing. But if it's motivated by perks, which frankly today are not, let's say, um, the most they are not the most they are not the only thing that should motivate someone to join an international organization. In fact, I think that the private sector today is a lot more lucrative in many respects. But I think that if you want to join a place like the World Bank, or even the UN, the UNDP, or any of the UN agencies, or other international NGOs, which also do very interesting things, sometimes even more at a more cutting edge speed or degree than a bigger international organization. I think it's very useful to have uh, a set of other ideas of why you want to work there, beyond the fact that you want to work there for the prestige, or for the glory, or for the perks, which aren't unsubstantial, but they aren't the only thing. Um, and so, to come back, I do think some degree of private sector experience, by which I don't necessarily mean working for a company or even a private law firm, but something that, a person who's a litigator is, in a sense, a private practitioner, right? So, sort of non-affiliated to an organization, but practicing law, since that's what we're talking about, with real clients, in a sense of clients paying you for the particular case rather than getting a salary at an organization. That experience can significantly expand what you can bring to the table when and if you ultimately decide to join a bank career, because that experience may also uh, convince you that maybe working at a big organization is not for you, right? And there are certainly people who go in between. It's harder to do, especially if you work for a specialized organization. But going back and forth between the private sector and an international organization is quite common these days. Oh, and I guess a couple of other points on this idea of building careers. Of course, working um, in as diverse fields as possible is one thing. I don't know if a foreign internship is necessarily, absolutely required, as many people suggest. I think it may be interesting if an Indian law student, you went to Sri Lanka and worked, which is what I did. It wasn't a great, going to Geneva or Vienna like people are able to do today. But I think working, let's say, I have a friend who's just graduated a few years ago from GNLU, whose internship was working with refugees in Kuala Lumpur. And now he's in Bangladesh working in Cox's Bazar, where the Rohingyas are, right? So that's a very interesting, very alternate type of internship or experience while in law school that has propelled him into a career in an international organization that's very different from mine, but is a very interesting experience, an out of the box approach. Learning languages is also important. Now, I think it's a bit hard to squeeze this in a 5-year degree. Everybody who starts usually ends up not succeeding to learn, let's say, French or Spanish while you're in 5 years. But I think that's where Indian law students sometimes can bring an edge if they know. And by this, I don't mean going to a restaurant and ordering a meal, but actually having working level legal proficiency in another language, a UN language, will certainly help. So that is something else. And then, of course, the other things I mentioned, which is having good reading, research, writing skills, but also being curious about the world.
Yes, Vikram, and I think, as you said, getting prior experience and at the same time really diversifying not only the work you've done but also the experience that you've gotten prior to looking at working at an international organization such as the World Bank is something that many people, especially law students, often forget when they look at the prospects at working at such a institute. Additionally, taking from the internship point that you mentioned as to how important these experiences are when you're deciding not only whether or not you want to pursue a career at a particular institution, but also really finding your own calling as a law student in this vast field of law. I would like to talk about the legal vice presidency internship, which is offered by the World Bank and is an amazing opportunity for law students to experience what work at the bank really is like. So, firstly, I would like to know what this internship entails and what a law student such as myself should expect going into this, not only the selection process, but also the internship itself. But I'd also like to know what you think makes an exceptional candidate for such a program.
So this internship program is different from what I described earlier, which is the fellowship program from NYU. That is sort of an NYU sponsored program, which some of the other schools do have too as well. But NYU made a decision very early to have a highly focused program on international organizations where they place their fellows. And so they have fellows going to different types of international organizations. I know other schools are also trying to emulate them, but of course, there's a question of money and then the first mover. The World Bank internship program is different. This is run by the World Bank. Um, um, it is, I think, an amazing opportunity. Now there is a World Bank wide internship, which means it's not only with the legal department, but it can also cover other departments. And I do not know what are the specific requirements, I'm afraid, for the general internship program in terms of whether they look at lawyers or economists. I know there are interns who come from different streams, So it would be good to visit the World Bank's website to look for the very specific requirements. But I think it's an amazing opportunity. Certainly, the interns I worked with who've come in through the World Bank internship program and then been placed in the World Bank's legal department, but also the World Bank's legal department has its own internship program, which also is available on the World Bank's website. I think there was a LinkedIn announcement a few weeks ago. You can just Google or search for it on LinkedIn. Um, um, that program, the World Bank legal internship program, places interns with, again, different people who do different things. I've described what I do. Many of my colleagues do very different stuff from what I do. Some of them are hardcore finance lawyers working on, the sort of let's say cutting edge financial instruments such as derivatives, hedging products, very sort of law firm like work, sovereign debt and sovereign debt restructuring guarantees. And then there are others who work on human rights, on the environment, on climate change, on HIV/AIDS. So it's like I said, it runs the gamut. And in a way, we have sort of our department is like a law firm with diverse people practicing law, and there are lots of generalists like me as well. But I think that the legal intern will be placed with, they might honor a preference if somebody's asked, but they will generally be assigned to people who ask for interns. I know there was a call that went out a few weeks ago. And I think whatever the work one is given as part of the internship will uh, quite likely be very interesting. I can't guarantee it will be exactly what the intern wanted, but I certainly think if you're open, as I said, I'm curious, I think you'll have a great time. And in terms of what makes an exceptional candidate, academic excellence, of course, is an essential requirement. I'm always someone who goes around saying, well, grades don't matter so much, but they do in the real world, unfortunately. So if you don't have those grades, you have to find ways of you know, building a candidacy that's formidable in other respects. But grades are often the variable. I recently had these selections, as I said, and there was a toss-up between two candidates, and the one of the people in the selection committee said, "Well, maybe we should look at the grades." And I said, "No, no, no, no. I don't want to look at the grades, but because it might be where they went to school and what courses they took. But I know it is an important requirement to others, and sometimes is the only way to decide, between one candidate and another. So that's something which is important. I think it's also important to have a discernible and keen interest in international development, the World Bank. You don't have to be brimming with enthusiasm to the point of being overflowing, but I still think you need to know what the World Bank does, what international development vaguely means, because nobody knows what it actually means in a very precise legal way. And you can also indicate what development experiences you've had. Not everyone, of course, has a chance to go on a foreign internship like the one I described earlier, that my friend had by going and working in a refugee camp. Um, so that we get. But you could have volunteered at a local NGO in where you live, where you study law in that community, or being particularly active about a cause. I'm not suggesting writing a letter, like filing a PIL or a contempt petition, but there are other ways to sort of, let's say, be active about causes, writing, tweeting, talking, going and joining marches, I suppose, in a peaceful way about a cause. And all this can be reflected in an application to show that you're more than just what your resume presents in terms of a good school or a great sort of set of grades or a compelling list of publications. What else you've done also matters. Um, Now, apparently, there is a research question as part of the legal internship program at the World Bank. I have not, that was not the route I pursued to come in, so I actually can't tell you what type of questions are asked. But it is important to write a concise and well structured response to it. It's probably going to be some sort of, let's say climate change. What would you do if you had to, I'm giving a completely hypothetical situation. If you had to draft a treaty or find a legal solution to some climate problem. So in this respect, it's very important to write clearly, be clear, use simple but powerful words, not too much jargon. And I think that will often make a difference. I certainly think that people who write clearly to me immediately stand out over those who may have had, 50 other things that seem impressive, because at the end of the day, what we are often looking for is someone who can write well, who can work with us, therefore, right? But also, of course, a curious and keen mind. So I think I'll leave it there, Rudra.
Thank you for such a well detailed answer. I'm sure our listeners will be extremely benefited by just an intake of somebody actually working at the World Bank telling you how to go about it. Shifting gears slightly, as somebody, Vikram, that has studied comparative constitutionalism, do you think that there are implications on the functioning of international organizations vis-a-vis different countries having different provisions in their constitutions? If yes, how exactly do we reconcile these differences? And does the World Bank in its functioning also face challenges because of the same? And how does it go about solving it?
Okay, this is a complex question because I think it can be understood, asked in different ways and understood in different ways. So let me respond the way I understand it. In terms of sovereignty, of course, we are still very much in the Westphalian system, right? We are international law is, in that sense, even though the subjects of international law now are much are more than just member states. Um, it is still a field that is primarily driven by by nations, by countries, by the countries of the world or the international community. And of course, international institutions now exist in a much greater way than ever before. There are more international institutions now, I think, than countries that, and of course, they are formed in different ways. But the dominant way in which international organizations, and I'm not talking about international NGOs, I'm referring to international intergovernmental organizations. The dominant way, with some very rare exceptions, that these organizations emerge or are founded or are born are through a treaty-based process by which member states come together to draft the constituent treaty and then, sign the treaty. And when a critical mass of countries have adhered to the treaty, the organization comes into existence. There are, of course, other ways in which international organizations can also come into being, such as through a resolution of the Security Council or General Assembly, especially for the subsidiary bodies of the UN, such as UNDP. And then there are examples like ICRC, the International Committee of Red Cross, which is an international organization and is recognized as one because of its role in international humanitarian law, but at its core, it's still sort of a private entity registered in Switzerland. So that is a big subject unto itself. But the destinies of most of these state created organizations are still very much controlled by their member states, or in the World Bank's case, their shareholders. So, from a legal perspective, I think you can compare international organizations with countries with national systems that have constitutions, because, like I said, an international organization is usually constituted by a founding treaty or resolution. In the World Bank's case, it is the Articles of Agreement. But here is also where the differences start, right? A corporate lawyer might view the Articles of Agreement, because they are called the Articles and not a constitution, as a corporate memorandum of association under company law or the charter of a company. So the corporate lawyer, and we have quite a few of them, would be inclined to use ordinary corporate law, corporate governance principles in interpreting what this instrument or the charter means, right? But a public law person with international law background, or even a comparative constitutionalist, as you put it, um, may say this is the international law organization's international founding treaty and should be understood and interpreted according to the international customary and conventional law on treaty interpretation, the Vienna Convention. Um, there may be still others who say it is the constitution of an organization's ecosystem, which allocates powers and responsibilities among various organs and defines limits of what the organization can do, its mandate, its privileges and immunities. So again, that would be a third process. And there's a field now emerging in international law called sort of international constitutional law, which is not directly related to this, but in a way has synergies to this point. So all this can impact how international organizations operate, how they deal with their member countries, how they also deal with other stakeholders, such as in the World Bank's case, project affected persons, NGOs, people who want to research the World Bank's history, or those who want to basically get involved in consultations about what the World Bank does. And so this affects how this idea of what sort of organization you are and what paradigm or framing you have can also then impact internal governance arrangements, right? How countries view their roles vis-a-vis the World Bank. And then, of course, the larger issues of accountability to civil society and ordinary persons. Now, this is going a bit off topic, but I think that this is a very, let's say, complex question to ask. So I've just offered a few ideas, which I hope make sense.
For sure, Vikram. And you have really helped us deconstruct the complicated question and get a better understanding of your thoughts. Now, coming to the concluding end of our podcast today, you've been extremely patient with us, and we thank you again for the same. A quick scroll of your LinkedIn will reveal your romance with philately, right? And you continue to remain a life member of the South India Philatelist Association. So we wanted to know more about how, even in this busy environment, about how where every day is sort of a hustle, that's how it's portrayed, not just by the media, but that's just how you envision the life of anyone living or working at an international organization such as the World Bank, right? How have you kept your interest in philately alive, and if you could shed any light on the same, that'd be really great.
Well, my interest in philately is something I don't mention very prominently when I introduce myself, especially at work, because most people don't understand it. It's a subject that has long faded from interest. There used to be a very prominent club. I think at one point it was the most important club at the World Bank for staff, the World Bank Stamp Club. But nobody I know collects stamps anymore. And I got interested in stamps again from a different age and from a different generation, when we obviously didn't have the exposure to the outside world that you have today, such as in social media or the internet. And so stamps, in a way, were our windows to the world. It's how I certainly got curious about international events, international affairs, the UN, and then ultimately international law. And I don't actively collect stamps, so I'm not an active philatelist. I'm intrigued. People think I am and keep sending me stamps. But I'm very interested, for instance, in stamps of where there have been wars and conflict, given my work presently, and I'm intrigued by what happens after a conflict. How do the stamps change, or what happens when a country just becomes independent? What do they do with the old stamps, and do they print new stamps? So there are lots of interesting things. There's actually a book that the UN, well, it's actually not by the UN, but it's produced by a um, stamps collecting firm, I suppose, or a philatelic institution, which is about the UN stamps, right? All of the stamps issued by the UN. But the UN itself has a stamp service, which when you can post letters from the UN headquarters or from the UN offices in Geneva and Vienna, I think, just like the Vatican, right? It has one or two post offices, so they are sort of more boutique organizations. But you also have so the UN post offices issue stamps, which are interesting on different international themes, on international law, or about international organizations. And then, of course, you also have countries that send UN peacekeeping forces, right? So India sent peacekeeping forces to Congo, and those soldiers, remember in the 60s, had to write home, and so they used Indian stamps, which were overprinted with a legend that showed they were used by Indian soldiers in Congo and in Korea, I also think. So, that is in itself sort of a very again, very deep and um, complex subject, which of course most people think uh, is antiquarian these days. But I, like I said, I don't actually actively collect stamps anymore. I try and keep what I have. But if somebody gives me them, I keep them, as it's kind of rude to reject them. But stamp collecting has led me to other things. I got interested in maps, and then from there into prints. And so I think that having some, to come back to your listeners who must be completely bored by now, it's important to have some hobby that does not necessarily have to directly relate to your work. I have collected, for instance, a copy of the first bond that the World Bank issued, but nobody else is interested in it other than me, because no one's interested in seeing the original certificate. Somebody comes to my office, yes, they are interested, but I think that it's good to have a hobby that gives you an outlet, that is hopefully not directly connected to what you do as a day job, but something that helps you disconnect. Now, you can do yoga, you can listen to music, you can be a gamer, and those are entirely legitimate hobbies, which are perhaps more, let's say, more entertaining than stamp collecting. But I do think it's very important, however busy you are, unless you're a neurosurgeon who works 17 hours a day and then can only sleep. I'm joking. But I think even the busiest lawyer must find time to pursue something else. You can also read, you can listen to a podcast, or you could do community service. And it's very important in that sense to recharge. So I think I leave it there.
That's a wonderful answer, Vikram. And I think with that, we have come to the end of our podcast. But just before we end the podcast, I would like to pose one last question, which is, would you have any last words for all the listeners, law students, young professionals, and everybody in between listening to this podcast today?
No, I would just say to thank you for listening to this fantastic podcast. I enjoyed it as much as I hope you did in being patiently pursuing me to find the time to do it. And I would simply say, stay curious about law, life, and all these other things we talked about. Thanks very much again, Rudra and Akshat.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Vikram. It was an absolute pleasure hosting you. And that's where you have it, guys. This was the third episode. We were speaking in conversation with Vikram Raghavan. And thank you so much. Today, I'm Akshat Goyal. And on behalf of SILP, thank you so much for listening.